and welcome to CoronaNomics What Just Happened, brought to you by Econ Films, where we go through the biggest events of yet another historic week with you, our live audience. So join the conversation and ask us a question on the YouTube comments or on Twitter using the hashtag CoronaNomics. I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
And I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent. Well, it's been another busy week in coronavirus news, new outbreaks of disease, new outbreaks of protest, new outbreaks of controversy, and a paint job to create a new red, white and blue jet for the Prime Minister to promote the UK around the world. Cost £900,000 or around 300,000 lunch vouchers. Well, at least it's cheaper than a new royal yacht.
Joining us to talk about all that and more is Tim Pitt, former senior advisor to two Tory chancellors, Sajid, Javed and Phillip Hammond, and now a partner at the business advisory group Flint Global. We also have Greene, economist, Financial Times columnist and senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Tim and Megan, welcome to you both.
Hi there.
Well, it's great to have you guys, and especially you, Megan. I think you're our first transatlantic guest on What Just Happened, which is excellent. Now, we always start with moments of the week, big moments that have caught our guest's eye. So why don't we start with you, Megan? What's really motivated and excited you in economic data this week?
So I'm actually going to highlight the retail sales data in the US, which is not a number I would normally highlight as being exciting at all. But this week it actually grew by almost 18% in May compared to the previous month. And that's up massively from a contraction of 14% the previous month. And it way outdid most economists' expectations. So I think it's emblematic of a couple of things. For starters, it's a traditional old school indicator that's actually confirming what we've learned from all these alternative data indicators that economists have been looking at, things like open table bookings or TSA data to figure out how many people are flying. We're all turning towards all these other data sources. And so retail sales actually confirms what we realized, which is that we've probably found a bottom in the economy. I also think it's emblematic because it's such a big number, and I think that's going to be politicized. It's an election year in the U.S., so retail sales up by almost 18%. A lot of politicians are going to go out and say, that's amazing, this is the best growth ever, and they're right. But we have to think about what the starting point was, which was April, which was the worst month ever. And so I think increasingly we're going to see the best data ever, and that doesn't mean that we're really in the clear. It's off the back of the worst data ever. And so we need to be careful about how we look at statistics because we're starting at a really low base now, so we're still really far down from where we were before this virus actually hit. So I think that's something worth keeping in mind because the Republicans are going to say it's the best data ever, and the Democrats are going to say, you know what, but it's still really bad, and people are going to be confused about who to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. We're going to see a lot of those inflection points and a lot of misleading analysis, I suspect. But on the subject of US retail sales, we've actually got a live guest from the United States, Louise Greenspan in San Francisco. Let's see if we can bring in Louise. And Louise, what's your question about US retail sales?
Well, my question is related to people who have not lost their jobs. For example, I'm in a position as a physician to still be able to have some disposable income. And I'm wondering, should I still be shopping online, for example? I've felt a little guilty about it. I've done a little retail therapy, but then I decided that maybe I should economize and try and save some money. But I read an article in the New York Times yesterday that showed that people at the highest incomes had the largest decreases in spending, and that was affecting people in the lowest incomes the most. So I'm wondering now, should I in fact be shopping to help the economy?
So Megan, what do you think? I mean, would you encourage, if we all want to see a V-shaped recovery, if we can, should we be encouraging people to go out and spend as much as they possibly can?
Well, I would say, first of all, go out and spend as much as you feel safe doing so, right? So the data that this article in the New York Times was citing is actually from my colleagues at Harvard. It's called Opportunity Insights, and it shows all this microdata. And it shows that actually in states that opened up really early, spending doesn't look any different from states that opened up really late, which just suggests it's not government policy that's keeping people from shopping. It's more a concern about going out and spending money and acting like normal, as we did before the virus. That's the impediment. So that should be your first concern. The second concern, I actually would say, depends on what you're going to spend your money on, because what we found in this crisis, unlike most other recessions, is that there's been a huge drop in spending on services. Think, hair salons, for example. Normally, you get a huge drop in spending on consumer durables. And if you look at the same microdata from Opportunity Insights, you look at where people have spent their money, actually. So when people got their stimulus checks, for example, most of it actually went into consumer durables, not into services. So there's this weird dislocation where most of the drop in spending was in services, and now when people spend, they're actually spending in consumer durables, and that just means, given this dislocation, it's going to take a while for the money to get to the companies that have been hit the hardest in this crisis. So I would say, if you feel safe doing so, go out and spend money on services where the low-wage, low-hour workers who are hit the hardest are working, rather than going out and buying furniture or installing a swimming pool. I would that's the smart kind of spending if you want to help the economy.
Yeah, let me bring Tim in here, because we saw the Chancellor Rishi Sunak out at the weekend, just before the UK shops reopening, really putting an emphasis on how good it would be if people did start going to the shops again. Do you think what Megan was saying applies in the UK context, that you want it to happen, but people need to sort of also think about their finances?
Yeah, I mean, from the Chancellor's point of view, he's thinking he's got his big mini budget coming up at the beginning of July, and one of the key things he'll be looking at is what's happening to consumer spending, and he will be desperate for you to be going out there and spending money. And I think it's interesting that some of the data we've been seeing in the UK as well is perhaps a little bit more encouraging than we might have thought 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Bank of England report released today thought that actually consumer spending was bouncing back more quickly than they thought, and I think that will be one of the really big decisions for the Chancellor. Is does he, in July, try and give some big stimulus to consumer spending? People often talk about a VAT cut, or actually, if spending is coming back of its own volition, does he hold his firepower back, perhaps for a budget later in the year? But as you say, the message from the government this week in the UK has been really pretty clear, from Boris on the weekend and the Chancellor as well. Britain is open again, shops are open, please get out there and spend money. That's a very clear message.
Yeah. So Louise, do you feel that you've got a bit more guidance about how you should act in this environment?
I would love to get my hair cut, but that's not an option yet.
Me too.
All right. I think we all feel your pain. Thank you so much for your question, Louise. It was great. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Louise.
Right. I think on the subject of the UK retail sales, we've got a pre-recorded question from Josh from Bristol, which is about the future of the UK high street, a very important question. Perhaps we can hear from Josh.
Due to the COVID crisis, the UK high street has taken a fairly massive blow when it was already struggling quite badly before this. Does the panel think that this has now pushed it over the edge to the point where it can no longer recover and its demise is inevitable, or can it still pull back from this eventually? And if so, what would that recovery look like? What changes would need to be made in order to make the high street profitable again?
Now, Tim, I'm sure this was an issue that you would have dealt with a lot when you were in the Treasury, the future of the UK high street. Can it survive? What's your sense of its future at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was a very kind of salient issue. I remember particularly out of the 2018 budget, there was a huge amount of pressure for us to do something quite major on business rates. There was a lot of pressure on us to introduce an online sales tax to try and level up the playing field between the high street and online sales. We didn't do that in the end, but we did have a pretty big package of business rates cuts there. And obviously the Chancellor has gone much further more recently, and has given a business rates holiday for the high street, basically for the rest of the year, and that is one of the main gripes. But undoubtedly, this crisis has accelerated that trend of people moving online. The real question is, how permanent is that shift? Are we seeing a kind of short-term spike, and people will then return to their previous spending habits, or actually is our move online, is this going to have permanently accelerated a shift online? So I think that's going to be one of the really interesting questions. The other one is, obviously a lot of the social distancing measures that are in place, or they're going to have to remain in place until there's a vaccine or effective treatment, are particularly going to affect the high street. And huge focus at the moment on the 1 metre or 2 metre, or somewhere in between, and where we end up on that. I think that'll have a big bearing on how quickly the high street can recover as well. Because you look this week, shops opening up, there were huge queues outside them, but actually, if you went inside them, there were probably fewer people than would have been there 4 months ago, because you can't have that many people in the shop. So I think the nature of the ongoing restrictions is going to be key as well. But I think it's going to be a huge area of political pressure for the Chancellor, and it's definitely not going away.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Megan, we've had a comment from one of our audience members, Eric Hale, and he says Megan is an honorary European, apparently, so that's very nice. But I was just wondering, is there the same level of angst in America about the future of high streets as there is in the UK, do you sense? Is that something which comes up a lot, shops surviving, sense of community, etc.?
Absolutely.
Americans love to shop.
Yeah, we're the land of retail, really, of bricks and mortar retail. And analysts have been calling for the death of bricks and mortar retail for about a decade now. And it hasn't happened, but I think that this crisis might finally be kind of the final nail in the coffin. I think people's consumption patterns have completely changed while we've all been locked down for months. And that as we reopen, I think it's going to take a while to change back, if it ever changes back. I think there will be a lot of scarring off the back of this, just as there was off the back of the global financial crisis. So I think bricks and mortar retail is going to have a really hard time. And anyone who figures out how to really move into the online space is going to be able to do well. I mean, look at how well Amazon has done off the back of this. I know, I have Amazon packages coming every week for sure. And I think companies that can figure out how to play in that space will do well. Unfortunately, that's a space in which there are some superstar firms like Amazon. And so it's a difficult area in which to compete. There's, really high market concentration. And smaller companies tend to get bought up pretty quickly by the bigger fish. And so, companies are going to have to learn to play in that space if they want to make it in this environment.
It's interesting, before all of this happened, and we were talking about the troubles of the high street before, I remember that a lot of retail companies were going to the experience, emphasising the experience. But as you say, with social distancing measures, probably can't pursue that strategy anymore. So it will be really interesting to see what retailers do next. If any of you have got a question at home, feel free to ask on the YouTube comments or on Twitter using #CoronaNomics. Now, Tim, it's your turn. What's your moment of the week, please?
So mine is also, I'm afraid, stats-based, and it is this. For this time, it was the release of the UK job stats numbers, the ONS numbers for April, which were released earlier this week. And everyone was expecting them to be really grim, and in lots of ways, they were pretty grim. Hours worked were down 9%. People on company payrolls were down 600,000. There was a big increase in people claiming work-related benefit, which includes unemployment. So there was lots of kind of negative data in there, but actually they weren't quite as bad as people had thought. So the underlying unemployment rate, people thought that would spike from 3.8% up towards 5%, but it actually only ticked up a very small amount to 3.9%. And I think going forward, the jobs picture is going to be the really big economic and political concern in the Treasury and in number 10. So from an economic perspective, obviously the big concern about a big spike in unemployment leading to longer term scarring, and politically, high levels of unemployment are obviously very, very difficult. So the real question is this slightly better than expected data? Is that just because the job retention scheme that we've got in the UK has been incredibly effective, and basically the spike in unemployment has just been delayed until that gets unwound over the next few months? Or actually, does this mean unemployment won't be quite as bad as we think? And obviously, Megan will comment on this, but we had a similar surprise in the US job numbers last month, and I think it speaks to a broader point, which is this crisis is just so difficult to understand where it's going to go next. And actually, the data is so all over the place in a sense. It makes it incredibly hard for policymakers work out what they should actually be doing. And I think particularly, again, I say the Chancellor's got this big moment at the beginning of July, but all this data makes it very difficult to know how much firepower he should firepower he should unleash then, how much he should hold back. It's a really delicate balancing act, and these big shifts in data make that kind of even more difficult for him. So it was kind of better news here in the UK than lots of us has expected. But the question is, as Megan said, and this doesn't quite apply on the unemployment side, but we were always going to bounce back from the trough in April. And obviously, it's different from for the jobs numbers. The real question is, how far can we bounce back? Can we bounce back really quite close to where we were at the beginning of March, or actually are we going to get stuck at 90%? The economy running at 90%, and that we will only find out over the course of the next few months.
What of you, Megan? Are you optimistic about the shape of the recovery? What shape will it be for you?
Yeah, so I mean, as Tim mentioned, we had a stellar jobs report in that it surprised massively on the upside for May. And so, for us too, it's a question of what does this really mean? And as Tim points out, we're going to bounce back, but how sustained is that? So I would say that getting the first 20% of workers back into the workforce is a lot easier than getting the last 20% of workers back in. And so the immediate bounce was always going to look like a V-shaped recovery, but I don't think that means we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. I think it's actually going to be a much longer, harder slog, and we probably won't actually get all the jobs back that we've created since the global financial crisis for a number of years. So it looked great for this one report. And we might continue to have a pretty strong growth figure in terms of jobs in the very short term from a very low base. But then as you go on, I think it's harder and harder to bring workers in. The one good thing about it, though, is that it does show that policy works. So in the US, we offered grants to companies who kept workers on the payroll, which isn't usually how we deal with labor market policy in the US. Usually we just let workers get laid off and beef up unemployment insurance to support them. And so, the turnaround suggests that policy actually worked. And so in a way, it's good that the US has taken a little bit of a page out of Europe's book on labor policy, because it does maintain a connection between workers and employers. And so if the whole point was to freeze the economy for 2 months and then defrost it and everyone can go back to normal, which would create a V-shaped recovery, and again, I don't think we'll get a V-shaped recovery, but the fact that we've maintained some connection between workers and employers makes that a little bit easier, even if I think it'll be a longer, harder slog.
Great. That's really interesting. We've got a question now on events from just today from Robin McGee, who works in public affairs in East London.
Hello. The Bank of England today announced another £100 billion of quantitative easing. If we're seeing this sort of thing in response to the economic fallout of coronavirus, shouldn't we also be seeing this sort of thing in response to other massive crises like global warming or homelessness?
So, Tim, why not print money and give it to homeless people?
Yeah, well, this is the really interesting debate that we're obviously going to have over the next. Actually, not probably. There's a kind of short-term debate on whether or not you can just print money to get through this obviously very difficult bit through the crisis, and I think everyone's pretty comfortable that this seems to be the right response. And actually, monetary policy and fiscal policy are working pretty much hand in glove. I think the concerns will become when you try and make that kind of financing what you call everyday expenditure. And obviously, the big concern would be that you get an inflationary spike. I think the reason why I think everyone is so attracted to this idea of just kind of going down the kind of modern monetary theory kind of extent of things is because it seems to me that no one is willing to make the argument that we need to raise some tax. Right? And I'm not saying now. I'm saying once this crisis is over and longer term, certainly in the UK, we are going to have to significantly raise tax, and that's not just because this crisis is going to have significantly added to the structural deficit. We have a series of very, very long-term pressures on the public finances from aging, from healthcare, from decarbonisation. And the reality is, I think we all are going to need to pay a fairly significant amount of tax. But that is more tax. But that is obviously much more difficult than just borrowing a bit more money. And so I think politicians are going to be tempted down this line, and I think it's going to be one of the really interesting questions is how far they get tempted down the kind of monetization, as it were, and at what point do people get uncomfortable from a kind of from a central bank independence point of view.
On that issue of sort of where do we go next, Tim, we've had a question from Ghassan Afboul, who's just finished his PhD at Warwick, and he asks, the government doesn't want to return to austerity or higher taxes. So how does it propose to keep its finances under control when it's highly improbable that we will see gains in productivity, which has been flat since 2008? What's your overall sense of how this government is going to deal with those post-crisis challenges?
Well, I mean, I think if you obviously there was a lot of talk pre-election on the government was going to spend a lot more money, and it was also going to cut taxes, and it was also going to keep borrowing under control. And obviously that doesn't all add up. I think if you look at what the government has actually done, though, and I think it's interesting to look at the budget that was done just before this crisis. There was obviously a very big increase in borrowing, but that was basically to fund an increase in public spending. The budget in March actually net raised 10 billion a year in tax, primarily by getting rid of entrepreneurs relief and reversing the cut in corporation tax. So it was not a big song and dance done about it, but the revealed preference of this government is that actually it's going to borrow some more money, but it is willing to raise some tax. But I don't think it will want any meaningful spending cuts. So the real balance for me is longer term. What type of deficit are we comfortable with over a kind of medium term, and therefore how much tax are we going to have to raise to make that add up?
Yeah, absolutely. And Megan, I think you wanted to come in, didn't you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we will have higher taxes. I'm not sure they're necessary, though. Economically, politically, I think that we'll end up with them. But this whole, discussion about how we're going to pay for this war, makes my skin crawl a little bit, because the answer is really clear. It's just deficit financing. The Bank of England and the Fed have promised that rates will be incredibly low for the foreseeable future. So yes, we have high debt stocks, but that's not all you need to look at. You need to look at the cost of financing that debt, and it's incredibly low, if not negative, at certain maturities for bonds. So the answer is just deficit financing. The central bank doesn't need to be involved at all, actually, except for to keep rates really low. And we can do this for ages. And we might get a slight boost to productivity off the back of this as we all figure out how to be productive with fewer resources. I know I've had to during this lockdown. So we could end up with potential growth and inflation that outstrips our borrowing costs, in which case we don't actually need to raise taxes. That being said, you are seeing this creep into the conversation, obviously in the UK, also in the US, with the Republicans saying, let's hold off on a new fiscal spending plan and kind of see where we are and whether we need to spend more money. I would say the risks of not spending enough money are much higher than the risks of spending too much. So I think deficit financing is the way to go. The risk is that if you borrow all this money and spend it, you generate all this inflation. We weren't able to generate inflation through the entire last recovery. We didn't do it in any part of the developed world. Central banks have missed their inflation targets for over a decade. A little bit of inflation would be good. It would help whittle away your debt stock. So, I'll die on this hill. I don't think we need to worry about inflation, in which case we should err on the side of doing too much rather than doing too little.
Yeah. And Tim, I mean, you agree with them? Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, I just think it's really important to distinguish between the short term, where I absolutely agree, we shouldn't be worried about the fiscal position at all, and the long term. It's very easy to say that interest rates are low at the moment, and therefore we never have to worry about our debt at all, or our deficit at all. But the reality is we're going to come out of this crisis with our debt to GDP ratio at its highest level in this country since the aftermath of the Second World War. That is debt that you don't pay off very quickly. That is debt that is paid off over decades. And therefore, you really need to rely on interest rates not just being low for a few years, but for decades in order for there not to be a risk there. And the other thing to add in, obviously, here in the UK, but also I imagine in the US, is that the long-term pressures on the public finances, as I said before, from kind of rising healthcare costs, from an aging population, from from decarbonisation, all our kind of significantly mount up from the late 2020s to 2030s, and at some point we are going to have to raise some tax to pay for that. And now that doesn't mean you can't live with a higher level of borrowing than we thought around a decade ago. But the idea you're not going to have to raise tax at all to pay for that I don't think stacks up. But again, that's not paying for the cost of this crisis. It's paying for the long-term impact and the long-term pressures that we've got on the public finances.
I wonder, Megan, do you think that the US is fundamentally in a different position in terms of being able to bear some of these pressures than the UK, because obviously it issues the world's reserve currency? Does America have more leeway than the UK, effectively?
Yeah, I think it does. It's partly because we have the global reserve currency, and that's going to be the case for our lifetimes, I think. But it's also partly because we have the biggest, most liquid asset class in the world, which is the US Treasury market. And so that gives us a little bit of breathing room as well. I'm not particularly worried about our fiscal dynamic, even though I agree with Tim that we have all these structural factors that show that our debt's really just going to keep going up. But we don't need to worry about it for a while. To address one of the questions that the caller asked, though, should we be actually, deficit financing to retool our economy for bigger structural problems like climate change? Absolutely. That was a no-brainer before this crisis. It's even more of a no-brainer now. So I think that's what we should be doing. And actually, the EU is starting to do that by talking about tying some of their recovery funds to their climate goals, which I think is a really positive development.
Yes, absolutely. Now, remember, if you've got a question, ask us in the YouTube comments or on Twitter with the hashtag CoronaNomics. Right, we're going to move on to Lizzie's moment of the week now. Lizzie, do you want to fire away?
Well, I've got two. The first one is the idea of folding the Department for International Trade into the Foreign Office, and the FT also reporting that potentially the Department for International Trade could be folded in as well, which is bad news for the Trade Secretary Liz Truss. We've also had, here's my second story, Michael Gove saying that the UK is definitely not going to ask for an extension to the transition period in the Brexit trade talks. Now, some people I've spoken to this week have said that it's because COVID-19 closes the gap between a no deal and Boris Johnson's unambitious trade deal, as they put it. So it's not economic anymore, if it was. And it's more about salvaging the government's political standing after its handling of the virus. It's a controversial view. But Tim, if I can put to you, you walk corridor of Whitehall, you must have encountered the man who's behind the government's ambitions to streamline the civil service, Dominic Cummings. What do you think about all of this?
So, I mean, I'll take the Brexit and I'll take separately. I mean, on the foreign or FCO DFID merger, everyone's got very excited. I personally think that the kind of machinery of government changes are never quite as important as everyone makes out. There was a lot of noise when my old boss Sajid Javed resigned, and because he wasn't able to appoint his own advisors, and Number 10 was merging the kind of political unit between Number 10 and the Treasury, and this was a big takeover of the Treasury by Number 10. But ultimately, it doesn't change the policy choices that you're faced with, right? You're still faced with the same economic trade-offs. You're still faced with the same advice you're going to get from officials. So I personally think that these issues get overblown, but obviously a lot of people, to have three prime ministers coming out and all disagreeing with you on what you've done as they had this week is a fairly unusual state of events. I mean, I think on Brexit and whether the COVID impact of Brexit, because COVID kind of potentially hides the impact of a no deal Brexit. There was a really interesting thread on Twitter today from Raoul Ruparel, who used to be Theresa May's Brexit advisor, and he did a long thread looking at this, and he said actually it doesn't really stack up, and there's a kind of number of reasons behind that. One of which is the sectors that are going to be hit by a no deal Brexit are different to the sectors that are hit by COVID, right? So in COVID, you're faced with retail and hospitality and leisure. In a no deal Brexit, you're looking at financial services, you're looking at pharma, you're looking at chemicals. So you've got different sectors being hit, and also the COVID hit is hopefully a temporary hit. The no deal hit is obviously a permanent hit. And I think the final point on Brexit is it is And I think it links to how quickly the economy recovers from COVID. It is all very, if the economy really is struggling next January, then possibly, yes, the impact would be masked. But if you have quite a strong recovery this autumn, and actually suddenly things are looking a lot rosier than we would have thought in November, admittedly that's unlikely. If you then throw in a no-deal Brexit in January, it's pretty obvious what has happened. And also, if the path of recovery for all other, advanced economies is the same, and then suddenly we diverge in January, I think people are going to work out pretty quickly what the reason is. So for all those reasons, I actually think the government's going to be pretty focused on getting a deal. And I think my gut is that actually we will end up with a deal. It'll be a pretty thin deal, and I think that'll be long-term challenges, obviously, but I do think we'll end up with a deal.
Megan, I'd be interested to get your position from across the pond, but we've got a question on this very issue from Henry in London.
I'd be very interested to know your thoughts on the government's Brexit negotiation strategy. I had thought that they would have the confidence to pursue a WTO-type Brexit withdrawal and taking a hard line with the European Union, but after such a disastrous coronavirus performance, I now have significant doubts about this. What are your thoughts on this question?
The confidence to trade on WTO terms. Megan, what do you make of the government's attempts at negotiating a trade deal with the EU?
That's right, as if WTO rules are, a prize here. I will say, my comments on Brexit come more because I'm a UK citizen and voted in the Brexit referendum rather than my views sitting in the US, because honestly, no one here is thinking about Brexit whatsoever. But I do think that there's a real concern that the UK is going to end up just leaving with no deal out of pure stubbornness. But I think it's too early to really predict that, because I think there's a lot of political posturing happening. And so I hope Tim is right, certainly. But, a no-deal Brexit, I think, would be really negative for the economy off the back of, the mother of all recessions that the entire world has experienced as a result of COVID-19. So it certainly wouldn't help. It would be an own goal if that's what happened.
We've also got another question on trade. This one's from Pete in Croydon. Is Pete there?
Pete?
Well, this is what Pete had to say. Pete says, the first high-level Brexit talks since January happened, and he wants to know if the deglobalization of supply chains is a good thing, or deglobalization mean that we've just alienated ourselves even more. Tim, can I put that one to you?
Yeah, so obviously, the kind of resilience of supply chains has massively risen up the political agenda, and there seems to be certainly a kind of initial response, which is this is an obvious thing to do, and this is, obviously we should be doing this and we should be reshoring. From an economic point of view, there is obviously a pretty major downside to that, which is building resilience into your supply chains, and particularly if you then add on administrative costs from Brexit, that increases costs in your supply chains, that increases costs to consumers, it increases costs to businesses. Now, obviously, there is a balance to be had there, and there are legitimate concerns about over-reliance on particular areas and in particular sectors in the UK. But I do think we just need to be slightly careful about, saying that completely reversing globalization is a kind of obviously right, the kind of obviously right thing to do coming out of this.
Megan, Donald Trump's been talking about decoupling from China for years, even before the pandemic. Is there anything positive about deglobalization?
Yeah, the one positive thing from it is that it has forced everyone to accept that globalization creates winners and losers, and we need to have a serious think about how we can support those who are most vulnerable in our societies, who have really lost out from globalization. So in the US, that would be the manufacturing workers, for example. So it has forced that conversation, but unfortunately, I think, as you point out, these tensions between the US and China predated the coronavirus. The breakdown of global supply chains and regionalization of supply chains or onshoring had already begun, and this crisis has definitely just accelerated all of that. But when I'm asked what's the world going to look like when the dust settles, it's too early to take stock, really. But there are a few things we know, and one of them is that we will have a more protectionist world. We will have less globalization than we had beforehand. And that actually a lot of developed countries are going to go ahead and implement industrial policies, which we haven't seen in decades. In the US, it used to be a politically toxic topic, but now it's one of the few things we find bipartisan support for, where we're trying to talk about how we can incentivize companies to come back home. How do we give them tax breaks to do that? That's a trend that I think everyone's going in. And it's not just between the US and China, it's between Europe and China, it's between parts of Europe. I mean, when Italy was in the throes of this crisis, Germany and France talked about export limits for PPE and medical supplies and food supplies. Now that was quashed by the European Commission, but just the fact that it was on the table, I think, suggests how much we all are retreating into our own corners.
Tim, Megan mentioned the industrial strategy. Do you think that this should be at the forefront of Rishi Sunak's mini budget next month?
So I think that a big part of it is going to be, I imagine, trying to bring forward kind of shovel-ready infrastructure projects, and so there's obviously a part of the industrial strategy which is about that. I do think there is an interesting longer-term question though. They're very similar, as Megan was saying, in the US, very similar in the UK. Industrial strategy, certainly on the kind of right of politics, was just a complete no-no for a very long time. Theresa May came in, obviously made a big play about that. I think it's safe to say the Treasury was at times sceptical about parts of that agenda, and I do think one of the things that this crisis is probably doing is making the Treasury and other parts of government think again a little bit around that, and actually whether the government should be more strategic around the type of investment it takes in the UK economy, and also the scale of those investments. I think that will be one of the really interesting things coming out of this crisis, to see. Now, there's been a lot of focus on the Conservatives and how they've become much less concerned on fiscal policy, much less concerned about the kind of about deficits and debt. There's been, I think, less commentary on the fact that more broadly their economic policy has shifted quite a lot over the last few years. The classic kind of free marketeer version, from Thatcher onwards. You've seen a real shift away from that, as I say, started under May, but the whole levelling up agenda is all based on big dollops of public money, right, on infrastructure and on R&D, and using low interest rates to borrow to fund that. So I think that's going to be one of the really interesting things coming out of that, is how ingrained industrial strategy comes as part of the UK's economic recovery package.
Definitely seems like you could kill many birds with the one stone. If any of you have got a question, it's not too late. Don't forget, you can ask a question on the YouTube comments or on Twitter using hashtag CoronaNomics. Now, Ben, it's your turn. What was your moment of the week?
Well, my moment of the week was when there was an outbreak of coronavirus in Beijing, obviously the Chinese capital. And this led to some schools being shut down, people being quarantined, etc. And I think this is significant for two reasons, really. First of all, because China was really hailed in the effectiveness of its dealing with coronavirus in Wuhan. And the hope was that they had shown at least one of the ways to contain this disease, and that the world's most populous country was actually quite good at this. The fact that we've had another outbreak in Beijing, I think, is kind of deeply worrying for the world. And I think it's also an important moment of the week, because it really emphasizes a broader picture of where we are in this pandemic. So there's a lot of pressure on governments to start opening up their economies, to start easing lockdowns, to start returning to normality. But actually, what the Chinese example shows is that this disease is by no means over. And even, if you look at other parts of the world, Latin America right now, it's not getting a huge amount of attention in the UK media, but they've got a really serious surge in deaths and cases. In fact, that's the global hotspot at the moment. And even in America, I'll ask you about this in a moment, Megan, but we've had a spike of cases in Florida today, just as the US president is and other members of the Republican Party are really urging an opening up. So I think this is significant, because I'm not convinced, as much as it might be good for the economy, I'm not sure it's the right course to be at this stage of, to have this huge opening up effort going on at the moment. But I wanted to ask you, Megan, first of all, do you get that sense? Is there a sense in America that Donald Trump is pushing too hard, the Republican Party is pushing too hard, and it's just not time yet?
I mean, that would depend on your politics, I think, mainly.
Right.
And that I think that is a statement on what's driving this. It's not based on health policy, that's for sure. And that's been an ironic piece of it, both in the UK and the US, where governments have kind of had this panicked, all hands on deck fiscal stimulus response. The actual amount that's gone to health policy has been relatively small so far in this. And I don't think that it's because, scientists have decided it's time for us to open up that we've gone and done so. In fact, about half the states that started opening up didn't meet the federal government's very relaxed criteria for opening up. I think people just got fed up with it. And it is worrisome because inevitably we're seeing a new spike in cases in a bunch of states, Arizona, Florida, Texas, for example. And that means that we might have to implement more measures. I don't think we're going to be able to go back to the full lockdown that we had before. First of all, we didn't really do it the first time around, not that stringently at least. But secondly, I just don't think there's any appetite for it among the public, and particularly given the social unrest that we've had around the Black Lives Matter protests. I just don't think everyone's going to go forget that and sit inside. Again, but it also means that if we open up and have to have any kind of partial measures, that pushes off confidence that we've actually nailed this, that we've contained the virus even further. And it's that confidence that's going to determine how quickly our economy rebounds. As I said, if you look at spending patterns in Georgia, one of the first states to open up, and spending patterns in New York, which is one of the last states to open up, they look identical. So it's not because governors said you could go out and spend that people that makes people want to spend. It's people feeling like we've contained this virus, and a night out in a bar won't end up with a stay in the hospital that's going to get people to open wallets.
Yeah. And Tim, in the UK context, obviously the UK government has come under quite a bit of criticism for trying to open up too early, with test and trace not being sort of fully tested and operational. The NHS app we found today is not going to be ready until well into the year, if at all. What's your sense about the pace with which the government is trying to open up the UK economy?
I mean, I was always, this kind of, obviously there's been a lot of pressure from the Tory backbenches in particular to open up more quickly. Obviously lots of concerns, understandable concerns about the economic impact of all this. I mean, my own personal view, probably with you, Ben, is, and I was very struck that quite early on in the crisis, Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, was pretty clear in saying, he would go quite cautiously in opening up the economy, because the biggest risk to the economy is that second wave, it's that second spike. And that really would be catastrophic, partly for the kind of the confidence reasons that Megan raised, but also you'd have a whole bunch of businesses that had just got through the first crisis. A second wave would just wipe them out. I think banks would take a very different attitude to lending. So my view is always being quite cautious, but I also don't get the sense that at the moment, everyone says we are reopening, really, really quickly compared to what people did in Europe. I mean, yes, a bit, but we're going still relatively slowly, I think. So at the moment, I think I actually think the government's probably getting an overly hard time for some of this. Obviously, they've made some kind of unforced errors as well. But no, I think it's going to be one of the really key things no one really knows, right? As we open up, how as we introduce all these new measures, it's one of these great unknowns. I think you have just got to push and see what happens. And I mean, I think the only thing I would say is that and Megan, you said that there will be no appetite for a second lockdown, and I think that is definitely conventional wisdom here as well, that people won't put up with it. But what I think is really interesting is the public in the UK. When they say, well, what do you care more about, the health impact or the economic impact? Is definitely the health impact. They worry a lot about the fact that the lockdown is easing too quickly. So there obviously are a kind of minority of people who have kind of gone out and people breaking the rules. But I think that the vast majority of the British public are still very nervous about going out, and kind of, maybe it's different in the US, but I sense they are very much on the kind of, we should take this very slowly side of the debate.
Now, you mentioned confidence, Tim. We've had an audience question from someone called Sean, and he said, will older and retired consumers be more cautious consumers in the future? Megan, do you think there might be an age difference in how people spend in the future coming out of this crisis? Might some groups be more scarred in their consumption patterns than others, perhaps?
So it's possible. I mean, I think that those who are higher risk are more nervous about going out and shopping. They tend to be older and less experienced with online shopping or, online grocery deliveries. So their spending might actually fall. And whereas you see kind of 20-year-olds in the US, anecdotally, if you look at pictures of crowded beaches, it's all young people. If you look at pictures of crowded bars with people packed in, they're all young people. So I do think that there's a generational change. And if we exacerbate the savings glut that we have, so if we get older people worried about going out and spending, and so not spending as much, that makes for more national savings. That's the trend that has kept interest rates really low, growth really low, inflation really low. It just means we're going to be stuck in this low everything forever environment for longer.
Well, that's all we've got time for, unfortunately, and we've covered a huge amount of ground, and we've zipped across the Atlantic several times. So thank you for making that Concorde-style journey with us. And I must apologise, Megan, we didn't realise you were a UK citizen, so you're not an honorary European at all. You are just a European.
I'm actually European. Yeah.
I hope you'll forgive us for that. But anyway, it's been a fantastic conversation. Really, really great to have both of you on, for giving your deep expertise to these really important issues. So thank you to Megan and Tim for joining us, and thank you for watching and sending in your questions. If we didn't get to all of them this week, apologies. Do keep sending us in. We might get them to them next week. And also, we welcome all your ideas about other areas that we might cover.
You can check out our latest episode on YouTube, an interview with Robert Reich, the US economist who served in the administrations of Presidents Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV for all our latest updates.
Thanks for watching CoronaNomics. What just happened? Join us next week for more. Goodbye.